Often overshadowed by her famous stablemate, the Hunter, the Seahawk was in fact Hawker's first jet. She was a worthy successor to the various World War II designs such as the Tempest, Fury and Hurricane. Designed by Hawker's legendary Sir Sidney Cam, the elegant Seahawk first entered frontline service with the Fleet Air Arm in 1953, and her superb handling was proven in combat during several conflicts around the world. "50 years after entering service, the Seahawk can still be seen in the air, thanks to the Royal Navy Historic Flight and the pilots of the Fleet Air Arm who fly her on a voluntary basis.
During the many years I was a trustee of the Swordfish Heritage Trust, I felt very strongly that there should be an early jet as part of the historic flight. I was particularly keen that this actual aircraft should become part of the historic flight because as a 20-year-old sub-lieutenant, almost 45 years ago to the day, I flew this very aircraft as my very first Seahawk flight in 806 Squadron. Everything about the Seahawk is a very pleasant memory. It was a delight to fly at all times in all parts of the flight envelope. It was one of the last straight-wing fighters in service in the Fleet Air Arm. It was ideally suited for carrier operations in small carriers. It was extremely docile in the landing and takeoff phase.
One of the advantages of having a straighter wing is a lower approach speed, and the slower you can approach an aircraft carrier, the better. So for an aircraft like this, typically around about 110 to 115 knots, whereas a Hunter, you can probably add another 15 knots onto that. Now that might not sound a great deal, but remember it's kinetic energy you're carrying into a cable, and that's all to do with V squared. So it's significantly more energy to dissipate when you have to stop something with a wire in not a lot of space.
For my fourth deck landing on HMS Albion, I could only get 2 wheels down. So when I was busy dealing with the emergency in the cockpit, suddenly the captain comes on the radio, and the captain is absolutely God in a carrier, so I was terrified he was actually talking to me. And he told me in no uncertain terms that I had one chance to land the aircraft on, one chance only, or if I preferred I could eject. So I thought about it for a couple of seconds and decided that I would land it on. He was fairly surprised. So due to the Seahawk's excellent handling and wonderful visibility, I luckily made a perfect landing, catching the target wire, the number 3 wire. The aircraft was undamaged, and I was delighted to be awarded a green endorsement by the captain a couple of days later.
The jet is actually owned by the Royal Navy. It's the last jet that the Royal Navy own since the Harriers went across to Strike Command, so very proud of that. But of course the Seahawk was one of the first jets that we had in the Royal Naval Service. We actually took delivery of the Mark I to 806 Squadron, the squadron colours of this aircraft, in March 1953. Pat Chilton, Lieutenant Commander, was the boss at the time, and within 3 months he was up to solo display standard, and the very first duty was for the coronation at Spearhead Review. So straight in at the deep end. I fly the Hawk for a day job, and this at the weekends, but it's significant that here we have an aircraft that was developed in 1947 with pretty much the very first production jet engine, the Neen, which produces 5,200 pounds of thrust, exactly the same as the modern-day Hawk. The speeds are very similar, 540 miles an hour being about the same for both aircraft. Very, very similar. We don't progress very much, do we?
On early Seahawks, the engine was started electrically, but this proved to be so slow and gave damage to the engine. So the later Seahawks had a cartridge start, where you have 6 cartridges like this in a magazine, and whenever the aircraft wanted to be started, a percussion head which fits on the top here fires off 2 cartridges, which gives a fast acceleration to the engine up to an idle speed, where the engine can then carry on starting itself. And there you are, one engine ready to start.
As far as its history, really only 7 years on 806 Squadron, so technology was moving very quickly in those days. But of course in that time we had the Suez Crisis, and every aircraft has its theatre, and that was the Seahawk's theatre. Really, the Royal Air Force were very new to the Hunter, and Akrotiri to Egypt was a long haul for them. Host nation support, of course, always being the driver in modern warfare. So from a carrier, this aircraft did great business in Egypt and took out most of their air force that were on the ground at the time with its guns. So it proved itself as a carrier-borne fighter in 1956.
WV908, an FGA Mark VI version, was transferred to the Royal Navy Historic Flight in 1982, and restoration was completed at British Aerospace's works at Dunsfold in 1996. Commander Paul Stone, who's currently displaying the Sea Fury, had the privilege of showing off the Seahawk's fine attributes at air shows after this major restoration.
Well, Seahawk's a delightful aircraft to fly. She's pretty viceless, and when I first got airborne in the machine, I was preparing myself for something that would be akin really to 1950s, 1950s jet, and not all of those were viceless machines. I'm happy to say this is a beautiful aircraft to fly. Very well balanced controls, and if you just take a glance at her, she's very clean, which means there aren't many aerodynamic fudges or tweaks that were needed. Very clean aircraft and beautiful. A fantastic, great honour to be able to fly it.
Unfortunately, after only 30 hours flying, she suffered major heat damage to the fuselage structure in the engine bay and had to return to British Aerospace for a repair.
We got the aircraft back in about 2002. The aircraft was very much a shell at that time. We had to do a complete electrical rewire. She had no engine in. We had to do a lot of work on the hydraulics, which had no fluid in. We had to service all the components. So there was an awful lot of work to do at that time. We were lucky. We had some guys from British Aerospace that were on loan to us, and gradually we rebuilt the airplane. It was a long process, but very, very rewarding.
Now ready to fly again, the Seahawk is being prepared for her first flight, with Lieutenant Commander Russ Eatwell at the controls.
4 flights in her, and then that'll be about 4 hours, and I should be ready then to go up, and 5 hours is the minimum that I'm required to have on her to display. It's an enormous privilege to fly anything in this hangar. I spent the last 2 years flying the Swordfish, and it's unique. It's the only one left in the world, so an enormous weight of responsibility there, but she's beautiful. As good as I had imagined it was. Very different to modern aircraft because the elevators don't have any power controls, no hydraulic controls in them. They're purely manual. But apart from that, and there have been quite a bit of trim change throughout the speed range, she's an absolute delight to fly, absolute delight.
After a successful first flight, an extensive inspection of the jet pipes is necessary before she can be cleared to fly again. Having been given the all clear, it's now time to work on the display routine that will be seen at the famous RNAS Yeovilton Air Day. For this, she'll be accompanied by her equally illustrious predecessor, the Hawker Sea Fury.
Pretty standard 6-minute display. It involves a limited number of aerobatics, but because you only have a few hours on the machine and every hour in the air is so valuable, you have to really tone it down to make sure it's a display that the crowd will enjoy, showing off the aircraft rather than the pilot, and really showing it off as the carrier-borne aircraft that it is, which includes gear down configuration, fly past with the hook down. You can still lower and raise the hook on this aircraft to really show people it was a carrier-borne aircraft, not just another jet in the sky.
We've waited 2.5 years for the Sea Fury to be flying, 5 years for this, and to be part of that today was just awesome, and Paul's a great pilot to fly in his wing. So I think we've got a nice show, albeit that we've just had 1 day to work it up.
I think it's absolutely vital for people to understand the heritage behind where they operate, also for the Navy to actually publicise to people we don't just drive ships, we also fly aircraft off ships, and have done for many years. So of course this is a fantastic way of getting that message across to the crowd, and aircraft have to be flown. Putting them in a museum doesn't really do them justice. They need to be flown to be exhibited.
She's such a joy to work on. There are bits, as with any aircraft, that are difficult for access, difficult to work on, but the end result is always satisfaction, especially when she's out on the line, engine starts and you know she's working as she should.
The Seahawk is an excellent all-round day fighter, whether it's in the interceptor role or in the ground attack role. It was absolutely viceless. It was a joy to operate on and off small carriers. It did everything equally well, despite only having one radio and no navigation aids and unharmonized controls. But nevertheless, this remarkable aircraft never ever failed to please.
I think it's function and form, isn't it? If it looks right, it flies right. We hear that so often. This is an achingly beautiful piece of design. Sir Sidney Cameron just got it absolutely right.
This is the last flying example of a formidable carrier-borne interceptor known as the Sea Vixen. Built by de Havilland, the prototype first flew on September the 26th, 1951. This stunning aircraft is owned and operated by de Havilland Aviation, a company that has adopted the famous name and specialises in maintaining classic aircraft. Her chief engineer now occupies the seat designed for the observer.
The original concept for this position was a radar operator. He used to acquire the targets for the pilot, some navigation, and basically a weapons operator. This is commonly called the coal hole, because everything originally was black, even the hatch. You couldn't see out. The side window was painted black. So, yeah, it was just called the coal hole.
And that's exactly what it felt like once you're down inside the cockpit. Very claustrophobic when the hatch comes down. And you can see that not a lot of room to spread about in. In front of me there's a large radar set, the AI-18, very powerful. Maximum pickup ranges of about 35 miles, and you could bring the pilot into 200 yards on a dark and nasty night before he could get visual on another aircraft which probably did not have any lights on. In here, behind the radome, is the business end of the radar set. Here we have the scanner, which is controlled from the cockpit, which scanned from side to side looking for targets. And then when you found the target, the observer would lock up on the target and the radome would freeze. The AI-18 radar, for its time in the 50s, 60s and 70s, was the best air intercept radar in the world.
She was designed as a night fighter, really. And I suspect that's why the configuration of putting the observer down in the coal hole, as we call it, so that he had the best possible view of his radar and the least possible distractions from light and so on. But as the aircraft evolved, it became much more of a tactical fighter. You considered using her in combat situations. She became an all-weather fighter and a combat fighter. And then the other roles, which all evolved, the tactical bombing role, the close air support role, photographic reconnaissance role, and indeed we had a nuclear role, strategic nuclear role too. So there wasn't much that the Vixen couldn't and didn't do, and she even formed a tanker flight too. The design team at de Havilland had a strong pedigree in fighter aircraft, having already produced such classics as the Mosquito, Vampire and Venom, examples of which reside at the de Havilland Heritage Centre at Salisbury Hall in Hertfordshire.
The idea of the Sea Vixen was we had experience on the Vampire, first of the jet engine, and we had experience on the DH-108, which was the tailless swept-wing research aircraft, which we built very shortly after the end of the war to investigate sweepback as a aerodynamic principle, which we had gleaned from the Germans at the end of the war.
I saw the prototype when it first came out of the hangar where it was being built, which was just next to where my flight test office was at Hatfield. And the first flight was later that year by John Cunningham. Well, it was a great joy to us because just previously to all of this coming out and being flown, we experienced the 108, DH-108, and just managed to get it to go supersonic in an uncontrolled dive. Whereas with this airplane, almost straight away, one was able to fly it supersonically in a dive under full control, and that was a great joy.
The development of the Sea Vixen had been something of a leap of faith by de Havilland, who continued work on the project after initial interest from both the Navy and the RAF evaporated. Although the Navy were to change their minds, the RAF opted for the Gloucester Javelin. However, there are many who felt the RAF may have been a little premature to reject the Sea Vixen.
If you're flying an airplane which you can't stall and has difficult stalling characteristics, which the Javelin has, as opposed to this airplane, which has excellent stalling characteristics and no limitations as to what you would like to do when you're upside down or spinning or anything else. There just isn't really a comparison from a pilot's point of view.
Brian Grant, the current pilot, first flew the Sea Vixen in 1965, whilst on exchange from the RAF.
At the time, my thoughts about the Javelin were I liked it very much. There I was with about 200 hours as a creamed-off pilot flying a very big night all-weather fighter. It wasn't until I'd been flying it for a little while I realised it did have limitations. It was good at its job, but its job was to sneak up behind people and, if necessary, fire missiles at them, rather than to end up in a dogfight. And a 20-year-old young lad would rather be doing dogfights. The Sea Vixen can dogfight.
You could always recognise a Vixen pilot by the fact he had an overdeveloped right arm, and she was quite a heavy airplane to fly. But once you got used to that, she was very responsive, and I found her a lovely airplane to fly in combat. The disadvantage was that she didn't have two pairs of eyes looking out. Your observer just had his little hatch, which was a pity, and being offset, he was slightly more blind on the starboard side. But one got used to that. It was a potent airplane, and it had many roles, and did them all well, I think, eventually. Well, in the early days, we only had a stern sector missile in terms of the fire streak.
Yeah.
And later, the red top missile, which gave you a head-on capability. So you were, fundamentally, if you had time, firing us. He was getting me so that I was firing down the throat of the target.
Yeah.
And then taking us round the corner so that we had a second shot with a fire streak from the stern. And then getting us right in as close as he could.
Although we had no gun.
But we had two rockets.
We had 2-inch rockets.
2-inch rockets, which was the final. And to do that, you had to be within about 200-300 yards. So that at night, on a black night, was exciting, really, wasn't it?
Great fun.
Most mid-50s fighters and most of the aircraft in the 50s were fitted with the Rolls-Royce Havens. They're all variable in power, The Hunter has an Avon 207 which produces 10,000 pounds of thrust. The Hunter is supersonic with that engine. The Sea Vixen has two Avon 208s, each producing 11,250 pounds of thrust. So it is an extremely fast aeroplane. It's very reliable, powerful for its age. She's got no vices. Even for removing the engine's very, very simple. Just lift it out through the top. She's a good British designed engine.
The last Sea Vixen squadron was disbanded in 1972. However, several aircraft were converted for training purposes in a simulated attack role. It is one of these versions that now thrills the crowds at air shows.
The flying of this aircraft is not difficult, but it is demanding, simply because, as you can see, it's very big. It weighs 14 tons empty. It's 53 foot, I think, across in both directions, and it is basically a flying wing. It's got 750 square feet of wing area, I believe. Two enormous engines. Unfortunately, it's got power control, but even so, even with the flying control being fully powered, it is very heavy on the arms. The pilot, the first time he flew this Vixen, was by himself in charge of it. So it was quite awesome. It's got an enormous amount of power, and when they sent you off for your first solo, you only went off with internal fuel, so the airplane was lighter anyway. So you only went off with about 18 tons of all-up weight. The performance was exhilarating. But one knew one had actually done all the ground school and all the training, including a simulator, so that you knew you could cope with the flight. But yes, you went off feeling a little nervous for the first couple of seconds because it was a big responsibility, but then suddenly you realised what an awesome aeroplane it was to fly, or is to fly, and you just sat back and enjoyed it.
I will always fondly remember the Sea Vixen because it was my first frontline aeroplane. When I was a young man, I was in love with the aeroplane at the time.
All those who've flown the Vixen have a huge affection for her. She is a wonderful shape. She looked beautiful in the air. During the Cold War, she represented a large step in capability in the primary roles and all the other roles she took on. And so I think has a very firm place in the history of the Fleet Air Arm and its heritage.
It's exhilarating. She's a very powerful aeroplane. I've travelled in most of the vintage aircraft, but you can't compare them. It's just like sitting in a rocket.
Well, one thinks one was living in a golden age of aircraft, and nearly all of the work we did in the war and the decade following had this marvellous feeling about it, and one still gets that when you see that aircraft. Here we were breaking new ground, and the sky was almost the limit, and it's still a wonderful feeling.
The Romans depart and the vacuum's filled by Scandinavians and Northern Europeans. 7 Ages of Britain with Bettany Hughes reviewing the Dark Ages at 10. More magnificent men flying classic British flying machines coming up next.